They were built to hunt armor, outrun ambushes, and survive the deadliest part of the front. But on this morning, Russian helicopters did not die in the sky. They died on the ground, at first light, while taking fuel. And by the time the fireball rose above the tree line, what looked like a routine dawn refuel had become a battlefield execution. Dawn kill zone. This was supposed to be the safe part. Somewhere behind the immediate line of contact, in the gray half-light before sunrise, Russian rotary-wing crews dropped into a temporary refueling point. Not a formal airbase. Not a hardened installation. Just the kind of improvised forward sight war creates when distance, fuel burn, and sortie tempo begin to matter more than comfort. A strip of open ground. Tree lines for concealment. Fuel trucks close enough to work fast. Ground crews moving in practiced silence. The objective was simple. Land, refuel, rearm if necessary, and get back into the air before the battlefield fully woke up. That is how these aircraft stay dangerous. They operate low, fast, and close to the terrain. They use dawn, haze, and broken ground to mask movement. They appear over a ridgeline, launch rockets, anti-tank missiles, or suppressive fire, and disappear before a slower response can find them. On paper, and often in practice, attack helicopters are a predator's weapon. They punish exposed infantry, pressure armor columns, and force the enemy to fight with one eye on the sky. And in Ukraine, that threat was not theoretical. Why helicopters terrified the front? Russian helicopters had earned their reputation the hard way. Even when losses mounted, they remained one of the few systems able to bring speed, mobility, and concentrated firepower to a fluid front. A gunship arriving at low altitude can change a local fight in minutes. It can rake trenches, break up an advance, strike vehicles trying to reposition, or support units pinned in open ground. The most feared platforms were built for exactly that kind of war. Heavily armed attack helicopters, often working with transport or utility aircraft, could reach forward positions quickly, exploit gaps, and hit where the ground battle was weakest. Their crews were trained to use terrain like water, sliding through river valleys, hedgerows, and folds in the land. They could operate beneath some radar coverage, complicate targeting, and shorten the enemy's reaction window to seconds. And that mattered because the battlefield in Ukraine was becoming a contest of layers. Drones watched from above. Artillery reached deep. Electronic warfare blurred signals. Air defense forced aircraft lower and lower. Every movement, every ignition, every radio call risked exposure. Yet helicopters still had one brutal advantage. They could be somewhere else before a map was even updated. That mobility gave them a reputation for unpredictability. It also gave their crews confidence. Maybe too much confidence. Because what made them effective in the air created a fatal vulnerability on the ground. The hidden weakness below the rotor disc. A helicopter in flight is difficult, violent, and fast. A helicopter on the ground is none of those things. When it lands to refuel near the front, its strengths collapse all at once. Speed vanishes. Evasion ends. Terrain masking no longer matters. Electronic countermeasures mean little if the aircraft is stationary and clustered around fuel. Even its own firepower becomes irrelevant for a few exposed minutes while crews dismount, hoses come out, rotors slow, and the machine turns from hunter into target. And the worst part was not just the stop. It was the routine. Dawn offered concealment, cooler engines, and a narrow operational rhythm that commanders on both sides understood. A forward arming and refueling point only works if it is predictable enough for logistics crews to support and fast enough for flight crews to trust. That predictability is what keeps sorties flowing. It is also what lets an enemy build a trap. Somewhere on the Ukrainian side, that pattern was recognized. Maybe it began with drone surveillance over days. Maybe with a signal intercept. Maybe with pilots spotted using the same approach corridor, the same hedgerow, the same open patch of ground just behind the line. The exact trigger matters less than the logic that followed. Do not chase the helicopter at full speed in the air if you can catch it empty, still, and surrounded by fuel. What they did not know was that the battlefield above them had already been watching the ground beneath them. Phase 1. Watching the routine. The trap did not begin with fire. It began with patience. Ukrainian reconnaissance had become one of the defining features of the war. Small drones, larger observation platforms, dispersed spotters, and digital networks turned moments into patterns. A single landing means little. Repeated timing means everything. Dawn arrivals. Short turnaround. Ground vehicles moving in just before first light. Aircraft departing low and fast toward the same sector. Once that sequence is identified, the refueling point stops being a hidden asset and starts becoming a target schedule. This was the first shift in the battle. The helicopters believed they were operating in dead ground, tucked behind the violence but close enough to influence it. Ukrainian planners treated that same space as a scene, not fully rear area, not fully front line, but vulnerable precisely because it sat between both. The terrain made the site look usable. Open enough to land. Broken enough to hide. Trees and scrub on the edges. Dirt tracks for tankers and support vehicles. In another era, that might have been enough. But in a drone war, concealment without movement is temporary. By then, the situation had already changed. The question was no longer whether the refuel point existed. The question was when enough high-value targets would gather in one place. Phase 2, waiting for the cluster. One helicopter destroyed is a tactical success. Several caught together is an operational shock. That was the real calculation. Strike too early, and one aircraft burns while the others divert. Strike too late, and the group disperses. The window is brutally narrow: after landing, before departure, after the fuel trucks commit, before security realizes the site is compromised. So Ukraine waited. This is where modern battlefield discipline matters more than firepower. Surveillance units must track without revealing themselves. Strike assets must be ready without firing prematurely. Commanders must resist the temptation to hit the first opportunity and instead hold for the better one. That kind of patience is hard under combat pressure, especially when the target is already valuable. But the logic was cold. Fuel trucks, munitions, helicopters, crews, the longer the site functioned, the more explosive it became. Then dawn did what dawn always does in war. It made people believe they still had a few safe minutes left. Rotors beat the morning air. Dust flattened against the ground. Aircraft settled into place. Refueling crews moved in. Metal met hose. Engines idled or wound down. Men focused on the machine directly in front of them, not the threat building somewhere beyond the horizon. And that was the turning point. Because another defensive layer was not waiting. Another offensive layer was. Phase 3, the strike comes in. When the attack finally came, the helicopters had almost no good options. Whether the killing blow arrived from guided artillery, rockets, loitering munitions, or a coordinated drone-assisted strike, the principle was the same: hit the refueling point when it is most compressed, most static, and most flammable. Fuel is not just sustainment. Under fire, it becomes an accelerant. Rotorcraft parked too close together become blast multipliers. Ground crews become casualties before they can even process the first impact. The first explosion would have done more than damage metal. It would have shattered sequence. Pilots preparing to depart suddenly lose order, communications, and visual clarity. Smoke obscures spacing. Fragmentation tears into fuselages, fuel lines, tires, and exposed equipment. Crew chiefs and support personnel are forced from procedure into survival. If ammunition is present, the danger compounds. If one helicopter is burning, the one next to it is no longer merely parked beside it. It is standing inside the kill radius. This is the difference between defeating a helicopter and defeating helicopter operations. In the air, you hunt one machine at a time. On the ground, you can destroy sortie generation itself. What looked like a refueling halt became a chain reaction. Fire spread across a space that had been chosen for convenience, not defense. There were no hardened shelters, no layered revetments, no deep dispersal. Just open earth, aviation fuel, exposed equipment, and seconds that vanished too fast to matter. But the real danger was still ahead. Because survival on the first blast did not mean escape. Phase 4, chaos on the ground. A helicopter crew under surprise attack is caught between two impossible choices. Stay on the ground, and you risk burning where you sit. Take off under fire, and you may lift a damaged aircraft into low-altitude chaos with poor visibility, disrupted communications, and no guarantee the next strike is not already inbound. This is where the attack became more than a bombardment. It became a systems failure. Ground control loses coherence first. Fueling stops mid-action. Safety checks disappear. A pilot trying to spool up quickly may be working with incomplete information, maybe with shrapnel damage already invisible beneath panels or along rotor components. Another aircraft may be blocked by wreckage, fire, or debris. A tanker truck hit near the landing zone turns the entire site into a furnace. If munitions cook off, fragments and secondary blasts make organized evacuation nearly impossible. The scene would have been brutally physical. Burning aviation fuel rolling black smoke into cold dawn air. Rotor blades twisted or motionless. Men sprinting low across dirt and ruts. Small arms security suddenly meaningless against an attack arriving from beyond direct sight. Radios overloaded. Orders repeated, then drowned out. And overhead or nearby, Ukrainian eyes were still likely on the target, adjusting, confirming, feeding the next decision. This is one of the harshest truths of modern combat. Once a force is fixed and observed, destruction becomes a process, not a single event. The breakthrough was an illusion if anyone thought surviving the opening strike meant the ambush was over. Phase 5, firepower meets logistics. Military storytelling often glorifies the weapon. Real warfare is usually decided by the support behind it. This dawn ambush was not only an attack on helicopters. It was an attack on the logistics cycle that kept them relevant. Fuel, rearmament, turnaround time, crew confidence, site security, command trust, all of it was hit at once. Even helicopters that escaped physically could still be defeated operationally if the refueling point was rendered unusable, if crews lost confidence in forward sights, or if commanders were forced to pull aviation farther from the front. And distance matters. Move a refuel point back, and sortie time increases. Time on station shrinks. Response speed drops. More fuel is burned just getting to the fight. Attack patterns become less flexible. Aircraft arrive later, stay shorter, and expose themselves longer on transit routes. A tactical strike at dawn can therefore reach into the day's entire battle rhythm. That is why this kind of ambush punches above its immediate body count. A burned helicopter is expensive. A disrupted aviation tempo is strategically expensive. By then, Russian commanders would have faced the same ugly calculation seen across the war. How close can you push high-value assets before Ukrainian surveillance and precision strike networks turn that proximity into suicide? Stay too far back, and your fire support weakens. Move too far forward, and the battlefield finds you. That was only the beginning of the lesson. Because once one refueling point is exposed, every similar site becomes suspect. Phase 6, the message behind the flames. The destruction at dawn carried a message far beyond one patch of ground. It said that adaptation had outrun doctrine. Traditional assumptions still linger in war. Move low, disperse in rough terrain, operate at first light, keep the forward turnaround fast, and you reduce risk. But Ukraine's battlefield kept punishing assumptions built for older sensor environments. Drones saw more. Networks moved information faster. Precision fires arrived sooner. The rear was no longer truly rear, and a temporary sight was only hidden until someone noticed the pattern. For Russian aviation, the implication was severe. The danger was not just enemy air defense missiles rising from the front. It was the integrated web behind the line, reconnaissance, target handoff, timing, and strike discipline. Not one killer system, but an ecosystem of detection and response. For the Ukrainians, the lesson was equally sharp. You do not always need to meet mobility with mobility or armor with armor. Sometimes the decisive move is to wait for the moment when the enemy's most dangerous machine becomes a logistics problem. Catch the helicopter while refueling. Catch the missile truck while reloading. Catch the assault force while crossing open ground. In attritional war, timing is often deadlier than mass. And for the men on the ground that morning, all the theory collapsed into one fact. The place they thought was a brief sanctuary had already been turned into a target box. The morning they never left. When the smoke finally settled, the result was more than wrecked aircraft. It was lost crews, shattered ground support, burning fuel, destroyed equipment, and another hole punched through the idea that expensive battlefield systems are safest just behind the front. The exact tally matters less than the battlefield effect. Helicopters that were meant to project force ended up consuming it. What was supposed to be a launch point became a graveyard of sortie plans, aviation fuel, and hard-trained personnel. The final outcome was cruel in its simplicity. Ukraine did not beat those helicopters by chasing them through the sky. It beat them by understanding when they had to stop. That is the doctrinal lesson. In modern war, the most lethal moment is often not when a weapons system is firing, but when it is exposed between actions: landing, loading, refueling, repositioning, trusting routine. That is where surveillance, patience, and precision turn a powerful platform into a helpless target. So the title tells only half the story. Ukraine did not just wait for Russian helicopters to refuel at dawn. Ukraine waited for the exact moment those helicopters stopped being predators and became fuel-soaked wrecks in the open. If you want more battlefield breakdowns told with this level of detail, subscribe and stay with us for the next one.
because they stood out more clearly against the sky and were easier to lock with optical sensors. Experience said the opposite. Flying low and closest to the train. He had only about 2 seconds to decide. He chose the high-flying group. That was the classic mistake in short-range air defense. The easiest target to see is not as the Pantsir cannon barrels lifted, chasing the climbing UAV rating toward the oil train almost unobstructed. While the real threat was skimming close to the ground, rushing straight toward the target to reacquire the low-flying FPV group. These UAVs had passed beyond the optimal firing angle, continuing to rush along the railway line toward the oil train. As the UAV swarm moved closer to the tracks, 4 Strela 10 air defense vehicles at observation area number 5. One vehicle locked onto the leading target with its infrared seeker and launched a 9M37 missile at Mach 2. Just 4 seconds later, the leading FPV disappeared in a small flash of fire above the railway line. But after the first shot, Strela 10 immediately ran into problems. The UAVs were moving along the railway, almost perpendicular to the observation direction of the Strela vehicles. At a distance of 850 feet, the FPV remained inside the aiming window for less than 1 second. The system had to rotate the launcher, reacquire the thermal signal, and distinguish the UAV from the hot background of the rails, the train engine, and small fires around the area. By the time the crew managed to lock onto the next target, it had already slipped out of the firing area. Battery warnings began flashing amber on the screen, and fighting against the headwind had drained energy faster than expected. The UAVs were estimated to have about 15% battery remaining. Seconds to reach the train directly, less than 20 seconds of stable powered flight left. Instead of trying to chase the entire train, forcing the train to stop. 6 FPVs carrying EFP warheads immediately moved ahead of the formation, diving toward a section of rail about 1 mile in front of the train. The EFP warheads detonated, their metal liners compressed into that slammed into the steel surface of the rails. The rails warped, the joints were blasted loose, and ballast stones were thrown into the air. In only 8 seconds, the section of track ahead of the train was no longer a safe railway line, but a twisted strip of steel full of debris. Behind them, the Panzer cannon barrels were still glowing red from the prolonged burst of fire. The 30mm cannons could generate terror, could not fire forever. After 30 seconds of continuous firing, heat began to reduce accuracy. The rounds no longer flew in tight groups as before, and the gunner was forced to release the trigger to avoid damaging the barrels. That pause lasted only about 15, but in close-range combat, 15 seconds is a massive gap. They decided to strike the tracks ahead. So the operators changed the plan. Ultra-high-speed penetrator stream. 6 explosions almost simultaneously tore along the railway line. Thick were cut instantly. These 3 UAVs immediately switched to backup battery power and radio control mode. But that also made them more vulnerable to jamming. Meanwhile, the remaining UAVs still maintain their fiber optic connections. Running through the glass core at a speed of about even as the surrounding area was being covered. Their signals remained stable. By Russian electronic warfare. From shelter number 1, the Ukrainian operators made the decision to continue the mission while withdrawing to the reserve. If they had been a few seconds slower, the entire control crew could have been disabled. But they had moved in time, and operators immediately located 900 yards deeper to the north. And during an emergency interception, time was something they did not have. At this point, 9 FPVs had had their fiber optic cables cut and were forced to switch to but the remaining 27 still maintained their fiber optic connections, meaning they were almost immune to electronic warfare. Jammed or distorted by flooding the same frequency band. Fiber optic cables transmit data through pulses of light, running inside a glass core. Trying to use radio interference to is like trying to turn off a light by shouting at it. The two simply do not directly affect each other. But the 9 FPVs using backup radio control, thin fiber optic cables trailing behind them. And then the irony of electronic warfare began to appear. Not only blind the 9 FPVs that had lost their cables, but also disrupted communications inside the Russian defensive area itself. At checkpoint number 3, the crew of a Russian BTR-22 armored vehicle saw the UAV swarm approaching on thermal imagery. Pantsir Air Defense Unit several kilometers away. But in their headset, there was only a long hiss of static. To transmit commands through the air. The remaining UAVs did not need to but the problem was not the frequency. Two familiar military bands. From civilian control frequencies, sweeping across different channels, they tried widening the jamming range. Why was most of the UAV swarm still operating? Transmission frequency bands if the jamming zone had covered the control and video strangely stable. But the remaining signals kept advancing. Disappeared from the screen. UAV signals using radio control. 7, then 11. trying to saturate the electromagnetic space. The system was pouring. The operator watched the signal bands on the screen change constantly. Inside the control compartment of the Krasuka 4, their signals so clean they were almost untouched. Some continued flying in their last direction, while others wobbled slightly because they had lost stable control commands. Then turn into chaotic blocks of signal. The images on their screens began to stop. Connections were immediately affected. And just as expected, the 9F most unprotected control channels video transmission and surveillance radar. Transmission power surged. Giant antenna array toward the UAV swarm. Krasuka 4 instantly turned its giant and immediately increased at a distance of 5 miles. Detected unusual activity. A Russian Krasuka 4 electronic warfare system. We're about to enter their first real test. Their signal had been swallowed by Russia's own electronic jamming layer. The Russians had blinded themselves while trying to blind the enemy. Nine radio-controlled FPV but the remaining 27, with their fiber optic cable still intact, continued flying almost completely unaffected. Krasuka 4 could spread interference across, but it still had no effect on pulses of light running inside a glass core. The $26 million electronic warfare vehicle designed to neutralize NATO drones and electronic links at a distance of 30 miles, was now completely powerless against FPVs, connected by what was basically just a very long fishing line. During the the train began to roll, slowly leaving its position at the Lugansk fuel depot. Its speed increased from 11 miles per hour to 16 miles per hour, then 20 miles per hour, and finally tried to reach about 25 miles per hour. The Ukrainian operators were forced to continuously recalculate the flight path. While they no longer had much energy to waste. At checkpoint number 3, the crew of the Russian BTR-22 armored vehicle that was the brief window in which the FPV swarm passed through their effective firing range. The gunner immediately rotated the turret, trying to keep up with the small targets rushing in at about 100 miles per hour. With that speed and approach angle, he could not aim directly at the UAVs. Path in the open air 65 feet ahead. The PKT machine gun opened fire, spitting out 250 rounds per minute, forming streaks of fire cutting across the morning air. But by the time the gunner calculated and dragged his fire along the formation, only 10 seconds to detect, track, lead, and dozens of small, low, fast targets that were constantly splitting formation. Geometrically, the task was almost impossible, but in actual combat, this number was only usually flies along a predictable path. Thin fiber optic cables trailing behind the UAV, glittering in the light like spider silk. It was flying, it was no longer there. In simulations, the target Through the sight, he could even see the He kept shouting into the radio that he had missed the target against the side of the turret. The BTR-22 commander but received no response. The system was still buried in interference. Continued rushing toward the train.